welcome. Today we're going to be introducing the works and ideas of psychiatrist and existential psychotherapist Irvin Yalom. And I'm going to be using two books. So, Existential Psychotherapy, which is basically the main ideas that Yalom puts forward, and The Gift of Psychotherapy, which both are very interesting and important. But if I had to basically sum it up, The Gift of Therapy is basically a shorter and more abridged version of the big book of existential psychotherapy. So I'm going to be using those two books. Please note that Irvin Yalom is not just a clinician, he's also an author that publishes novels. Basically, I'm not going to touch on them because I haven't read them, although I've heard that they're quite good. But I'm going to really be talking about the clinical aspect of his work, i.e., how he works with patients. So, for Yalom, the core of psychotherapy is a relationship. For him, that relationship is built, of course, on transference and countertransference, but not just. For him, he puts a lot of emphasis on the idea of disclosure. So, what is disclosure? Disclosure is the fact that if a patient asks you a question, basically you can answer with what you really think. Of course, there's nuance to be made here. It's not like if the patient asks them some random question you answer. There's a whole process behind it, right? But this is the idea because Yalom challenges the classic psychoanalytic idea that which we therapists should be white screens in which the patient can project everything, but we should never ever engage who we are in the process. He's against that. For him, he feels that the patient needs sometimes to know certain elements of our lives. For example, for certain patients, that might be very important to know if we're parents, to know, for example, if we're married, and so on and so forth. And he says that sometimes giving them a disclosure of what one is helps them not in a way to project, but in a way to get a mental representation. Sometimes some of them might need that in order to be able to trust a therapist. So it is a very important process, and one which I think at certain points can be very useful and very helpful, because it also helps the therapeutic alliance, i.e. the bond between patient and therapist. Basically, what he says is that disclosure is an asset, and he is very, very critical of, let's say, old psychoanalysis in which nothing was said. He even in this book, basically existential psychotherapy, explains that there used to be basically old analysts would not even help patients that are struggling, for example, with their codes, like let's say a very old lady that struggles in motorways to put it back on, that there would be a complete cutoff. Like there is no human contact between patient and therapist. When I mean contact, I don't mean physical contact. I really mean there's no hope, for him, there's nothing wrong with, for example, when a patient has issues, for example, sore throat, that you might give them water or if they're dehydrated. He doesn't see an issue in that. And so therefore it's a whole other way of conceiving of relations, especially because he explains that it's not going to destroy the relation and the patient isn't going to start becoming abusive because of that disclosure or because of that help. What he says is, of course, you have to put boundaries, but a bit of it strengthens the relationship. Also, he emphasizes the honesty of the therapist, that basically it's really about a true relation. Therefore, for example, if you're going to tell something to the patient, you have to be truthful. You have to, even if it's only an opinion or only a hypothesis, that it's true with you, therefore it can be true with the patient. This also adds to the fact that for him, for example, at certain very, very specific moments, not all the time, but very specific moments, sometimes the therapist has to do something extra with the patient. For example, he gives this example of certain patients, for example, who have had absent parents, might sometimes have to go and see, let's say, the movie that the patient plays in, or let's say the play that they play in, so to speak. So basically, it's a very, very important dimension for Yalom to build this relationship with limits, because he does say that it's not friendship, even though it's a question that he says plagues therapists of like, what's the difference between a friend and a therapist? Even though it's a plaguing question, it's not the same, because you do stay in your professional dimension, i.e., you're not going to talk about your issues with the patient, and the patient is there to talk about them and not to talk both of each other, right? So the rules are still clear, but they're much more flexible than would be in old psychoanalysis. He also sees therapy throughout the four lenses, which are very important, which are existential, i.e., to do with us as humans. So those four levels are for him universal givens, meaning everyone experiences them. It's not either this person does or this person doesn't. Everyone goes through these phases or through those processes, and it's how we deal with them that makes us who we are. So for him, those four universal givens are: the first one, the most important, death; secondly, liberty; thirdly, isolation; and fourthly, meaning and lack thereof. So I'm going to start with death, as that's the main one Irvin Yalom focuses on. For him, and for many, and he draws from philosophy, like for example Kierkegaard, uh, Wittgenstein, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole philosophical tradition behind Yalom. It's not just psychiatry, psychoanalysis, and so on and so forth. So for Yalom, death is the end of everything. Basically, it's the end of all possibilities. And it's something in which we're all confronted. One day we will all die. Basically, to paraphrase Rollo May, which was one of Yalom's analysts and friends, that the only thing we can be certain is that one day our life will end, and that's it. And that ending is both a strength, because it pushes us to do things, it pushes us to be, because our time is limited. But it's also terrifying, because we don't want to die. Therefore, there might be a whole set of psychological processes that we basically undergo or experience because we don't want to die. For example, anxiety. We might feel very anxious because we are so afraid of losing our lives or wasting our time that we feel anxiety. It might also be basically trying to find what he calls an ultimate savior, i.e., someone in which we can say, oh, they're so exceptional, they will beat death. Therefore, if they can beat death, then they can save us. It's also very, very noticeable in children that, for example, they might say things like, oh, daddy and mommy will never die. They will never die, and they'll always be there for me, and so on and so forth. Because the problem is, when parents die for children, is that the mortality of the children becomes completely apparent. That in a way, generationally, they're next. I mean, in terms of fantasy, of course, but yeah, this idea is that fundamentally mortality is a struggle. It's a human struggle, and we all know of it, and we all want to avoid it, and it causes anxiety, fear, and sometimes terror. And how we deal with it is what's important. And he says that we can help patients deal with it. So you might say, yes, but we don't change the fact that we can die. No, we don't. We never do. But what we do is help the patient use more of their possibilities, more of who they are, bring them more into the capacity to change themselves and the world before that time. That i.e., death is the end of all possibilities, but before that, many possibilities remain open, and that's something that we can help the patient explore, that sea of possibilities that's not infinite, but it's still very large, and to be able to enjoy that time as basically we are not just pleasure principle for Yalom, we basically seek a meaning to existence, which brings us to the second point, is that our existence has meaning. What we do is meaningful. And the problem, for example, in our modern age is that there's a lot of meaning that has been withdrawn from our societies, that what we feel, for example, in this new expression that has come to the forefront of culture of bullshit jobs. Well, that's it, that the meaninglessness of the task. And what he says is that we as humans can't really handle that. We can handle a lot of things. We can handle suffering. We can handle tragedy. We can handle depression. But meaninglessness is intrinsically for Yalom very toxic for the mind. In a way, it breaks down the mind rather than helps it. Therefore, basically, it's very important to maintain a meaning. And when I mean meaning, I don't mean that we're going to change the world, right? But that somehow it matters. That what we do has an impact. That we leave in something of us into the world. We are modifying ever so slightly or ever so humbly the whole plethora of the world. Even if what we do does not leave a eternal impact, we are still, as we're doing something, creating an impact. For example, having children can be very meaningful. For example, taking care of people. For example, if you're a medical doctor, if you're a nurse, if you're a psychologist, and so on and so forth, has meaning. Being a YouTuber has meaning. Being a viewer, for example, when you're listening to me, has meaning. All of these moments of meaning are so very essential for the maintaining of our being, because our being basically necessitates meaning. And death is the end, therefore no more meaning can be made after that. It's the end of all possibilities, both for ourselves and for the people we love. For example, when we lose someone, there's no more possibility of creating new memories with that person. There's no more possibilities of being with that person. So therefore there's an end. And that end makes all the stuff that came before meaningful. So basically that's death and meaning. He also emphasizes the question of liberty. And basically for him, and he quotes Sartre in this, that basically we are condemned to choose. We are condemned to freedom. What does that mean? That means that whatever happens in our lives, we have an ability to choose. So, and he's very, very specific on this. That doesn't mean you can choose everything. And that doesn't mean that everything that happens to you is a choice. For example, if you have cancer, it's idiotic to think that you've chosen your cancer, except if basically you've smoked and you've tried to provoke cancer and you wanted cancer. But this is very specific because it's not because you smoked that you'll have cancer, and B, that would underline the whole principle of the death drive. But that's not what Yalom is on about. For example, if you have a severe illness, you haven't chosen that illness. The path that you've gone towards, nothing should have led to that. Therefore, you don't have a choice, but you have a choice on what is going to happen next. Let's say you get the diagnosis. Getting treatment is a choice. Undergoing the treatment, saying goodbye to your friends, family is a choice. Choosing to how you spend the last years or months of your life is a choice, and so on and so forth. And the choice doesn't mean it's an easy choice. And it also doesn't mean there's a good choice and a bad choice. It's none of that. It's just that there's some agency, and the agency might be good, it might be bad, it might be positive, or it might be negative, but you still have to choose. Even a bad choice is a choice. Even the absence of choice is a choice. See what I mean by that? And he's very critical of all this self-help talk, which basically is like, oh well, basically you can choose how you feel about it. He doesn't say that. You can't really choose how you feel about it. For example, if you have cancer, you might be completely distressed. You might feel that your world is ending, that you're internally collapsing, and you don't have a choice on those emotions. They just are. But that moment where you have to go through chemo, or stop, or just basically you feel that you don't want to do that anymore, all of these things are a choice. And of course and I'm not advocating to leave chemo, quite the opposite. I believe that as long as there's life in a decent enough condition, whatever that means, it should try to be preserved. And I mean, we can have a whole debate on basically life and what is a okay enough life. And anyway, I'm getting misled in this. The basic idea is we always are condemned to choose, and no one can choose for us, because basically if someone chooses for us and we act upon the choice of others, what we're doing is that we are choosing the other's choice, right? So there's no getting around it. There's no wiggling our way out of choosing in those very specific moments, because we can't choose circumstances, but we can choose where it's going to go. In the same way that basically you might not choose to be born, but what you do with your life is basically your decision. So basically, it's a very important point, and one in which Sartre has worked a lot upon, the philosopher, which Irvin Yalom tends to quote, not like all the time, but specifically, and to very good usage, I feel. Anyway, this leaves us with the last part, isolation. Well, because for him, for Yalom, whatever we experience, we're always subjectively alone. For example, the day we die, we're alone. Another person is not gonna do this subjective experience of dying with us. So basically, we die alone, and we are alone within our minds. For example, once the lights go off, once you've hung up the phone, or said goodnight to your partner, or said goodnight to your children, or your dog, right, or any part of your environment, you're alone. You're by yourself. And Yalom says that by yourselfness is something that basically we all have to handle. How are we coping with being ourselves and being alone with ourselves, without the noise and hustle of the outside world, without the fact that the outside world is us? How do we deal with our inner subjectivity, because we are not others and others are not us? Even if they can understand us, they will not 100% understand us. That's an illusion. We never 100% understand each other. We just partly understand each other, but sometimes it's enough, and that's great. But how do I do when I'm alone? That's the big question, and we all have to face that, because at some point or another, sooner rather than later, we will be alone. And that aloneness is a matter of a question that might occupy the mind a lot. And for him, those 4 existential givens are very important. And for him, the success of psychotherapy is predicated on how much we talk about those existential givens, how much the clinician has it in his mind, and how much he talks about it with the patient. So, very interestingly enough, Yalom is very adamant on long-lasting psychotherapy. And basically, for him, he sees cognitive behavioral therapy in a bad eye. He kind of sees it as like a quick fix that fixes nothing kind of argument. Me personally, I don't necessarily fully agree with that, but that's his perspective, especially in the gift of therapy, because he has a form of skepticism on CBT and on any short form therapy. And I will admit that you don't work the same way in short than when you have the time, when you take the time to talk about all of these things. Because remember, the fear of death is because it's something so anxietyful. Basically, isolation, freedom, and meaninglessness. All of these things take time to deploy, to develop, and they take a lot of trust. Therefore, for Yalom, the trust is essential through this idea of disclosure when it's needed, and also for trying to understand the patient. So basically, Yalom has those givens of existence, and I should say that he's also a group therapist, and that's at the very start of his career what he was very, very well known for. And basically, that groupal aspect, for him, the therapist needs to be part of the group. There's no, you're the professional and the other ones are out. A bit like in psychotherapy. This is a relationship, therefore the therapist is as engaged as the patient is. Even though the patient comes for healing, the therapist needs to be there with them. And it's that form, the therapist needs to be dedicated to what they're doing. They can't be just a remote part of it. They have to be a core element, and their personalities have to be a core element of the relationship, of this whole dynamic. And the same goes with groups. Groups also have a very specific function in Yalom, because basically it's all about how the group behaves. And basically for him, every part of the group is important. Every individual in the group is important. And basically a good group is a group in which there's some form of basically help within the group. And the group helps each other out and each and every member tries to analyze the dynamics of the group. So that part I'm the least familiar, because I didn't read the book about the groups. I'm pointing because I have it in my library, but it's like 1,000 pages and I'm not quite gonna do it in the foreseeable future. So basically it's there, but it's there for another day, right? So, but I just wanted to bring it up because it's there and it's still a very important part of his work. So the last thing I'll touch upon is basically his novels, which I haven't read, but I've heard from people that I trust that they're very good, they're very interesting, and they link psychology and philosophy, which I feel interesting because in the two books I've read of him, it's exactly that. It's like a mixture of both philosophy and psychology, and I really liked it for that aspect. I should also add that even though he's a medical doctor, Yalom was never, at least from my understanding, never that interested in the medical side of things, because he was not necessarily interested in prescribing medication, but more on this existential aspect of psychotherapy. Therefore, in the later years of his life, when basically doctors were more interested, the interns, in knowing how to prescribe, what to prescribe, he basically saw that psychiatry was moving on from psychotherapy, so basically he felt that he could not bring the youths what they needed. So it's a very interesting thing because basically he lived the outgrowing of psychiatry and psychotherapy, the like falling out of love of both disciplines, which is a reality, with something that also has happened in France. Basically, there's a divorce between psychiatry and psychotherapy. One day, hopefully, both will merge again, but it's not in the immediate future. Anyway, so basically, Yalom has very interesting points, and for him, there's a whole way of helping others. And he feels that his existential therapies can help virtually everyone, with one or two exceptions being people with severe psychosis, which he feels is more biological rather than psychological, therefore cannot be helped in the same way by psychotherapy. So fundamentally, what he opens up to is a more universal treatment, a treatment in which everyone has to find their answers to the four givens. I'm going to repeat them. The question of death, what do we do with our lives? The question of freedom, what choices do I want to make? What impacts are going to have my choices? Isolation, I am by myself, how am I going to cope with myself? And with the idea that I'm the only one that experiences my existence. And lastly, this question of meaninglessness and meaning. What meaning do I find in life? What is meaningful for me? And those four givens, for him, once they're analyzed, can help the patient discover who they are, where they want to go, and basically live a fulfilling life, which I found very interesting. And on the whole, I love his perspective because I feel that it broadens our scope as psychotherapists. Of course, I'm not saying it's perfect because sometimes I feel that he might go a little too far, notably in the terms of disclosure, or basically his actions towards the patients. But I must admit that those books are brilliant, and I do feel that they offer the clinician a sensibility and a flexibility that basically older therapies like psychoanalysis do not typically offer, or that new therapies like CBT, DBT, and so on and so forth don't offer either, because they are based in protocol and speed. So basically, I feel that Yalom hits a sweet spot between the ability of the clinician to engage with the patient, but also for the time that is necessary to build that relationship with the patient and to explore those depths of the mind. So basically, a very interesting author, and that pretty much sums it up. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.